So I'll just say a few words about Mark. I think he's well known to the regulars here. He's been a fellow of the Linnean Society now for over 20 years. And he's our honorary curator of the Society's herbaria, of which we have two. So we have Linnaeus's herbarium, which is around 14,000 specimens. And we also have the herbarium of Sir James Edward Smith, who was our founder. And I believe there are some 26,000 specimens in that collection. So Mark has worked for over a decade at the Natural History Museum in London, and he's been vocal on the role of plants and the public's understanding of them, and promoting plants and the study of botany. He's a regular public speaker on the BBC as well as other places. He's now a consultant botanist, specializing in forensics, botanical training, and the history of botany. And I have to admit that whenever I'm on holiday and I come across a plant, I send a quick image to Mark, and he's straight back with the ID. So he's very reliable. If you don't know what you're looking at, ask Mark. So Mark's lecture today accompanies the launch of his book, Murder Most Florid, and that explores how plants and other components of the environment can help crime scene investigators. Botany has actually been used in criminal investigations for many years, and forensic botanists use traditional disciplines such as plant taxonomy, morphology, palynology, alongside other researchers in environmental forensics. And they are embracing the opportunities that DNA-based technologies afford. So without more ado, I will hand over to Mark to tell us about Murder Most Florid.
Good evening, everybody. Hello. Little bit of feedback there. What have we got going on? Leanne, do you know what the problem is there? Thank you, my dear. Can you all hear me nice and clearly? Super. So I'm going to be taking a sort of bit of a ramble, partly through my life as a botanist, because maybe it sheds light or tells tales about how I got to become a forensics investigator, but also to talk about the importance of plants today in the natural world and for our well-being. And I'm actually just going to say momentarily to the Linnean Society, both in terms of the people who are here now and the people who've worked here over the years, and as an institution, this is one of the most important places in my life personally, because without the Linnean Society, I wouldn't have my doctorate and I wouldn't be Dr. Mark Spencer. They helped so much along the way in my own career. So thank you very much to the Society. And I would also say for any of you who are interested in the natural world, please, please, please join the Society, become a fellow. We're a broad and friendly church. Even though we're an august and academic institution, we are a friendly one. So the next thing I'm going to say about this talk is that it's a light touch in the world of forensics. I'm not going to be going in depth into the more challenging aspects. You are not going to see challenging images of dead people. The reason for that is, at times it's inappropriate, frankly. I can tell you a story about what it's like to work on forensics without chilling you to the bone, hopefully. Although it's fair to say what I do see at times and hear about is deeply unpleasant. Having said that, also, sometimes people are unexpectedly themselves disturbed by hearing about a topic such as this. If you do feel uncomfortable, there is no shame in saying, I'm actually going to leave the room and just move and head off yourself. You really shouldn't feel compelled to stay out of bravura. So I like to give those gentle warnings because I have had one experience of a person who became quite strongly emotionally disturbed whilst I was doing some training on forensics because they'd had a very, very traumatizing experience shortly beforehand, and the experience of me talking about it basically triggered emotions for her. So, me and my journey to this place. If I can get this to work properly. Yeah, why is it not working? Can you, sorry. being grumpy. I'll just use my finger. It's right, I can cope. I can use this instead. Oh. This is my mother's favourite picture of me. It's also, I think, one of my favourite pictures of me. Sweet little boy that I was. I vaguely remember this day going to the local photographers in my hometown in Banbury, the top end of Oxfordshire, and having this taken. And I was very, very proud of that suit, and I loved it dearly. For those who are sort of family and friends of mine know that my passion for plants has been going on for an exceptionally long time. But there is another secret love I have, which some of you probably don't know. And that's ducks. There's a very nice and easy way to make me happy, and that's to show me a picture of a duck. And this was my very first pet, Daisy, who was a boy. It foretold so many things about me. He was my first love. He was a very, very... Ah! Oh, sorry. The IT system is having a turn. That will... Help us, Leon. So, yes, ducks were my first love, and I still find them very, very satisfying emotionally to see a pond full of ducks. The reason I'm telling you this is not just purely to sort of win you over, but to really talk about actually how important it is, I think, that we think about in the modern world how we are, as people, losing, and societies losing connection, thank you, Pat, losing connection with the natural world, and that's to our detriment in so many ways. And the ways that we go from being a small boy like this, hugging his pet duck, to a mad scientist like this, lurking in the undergrowth in the Isles of Scilly, collecting wild flowers, or an august botanist looking after Carl Linnaeus' herbarium, is something that we really need to think about, because actually, you know, we are losing botanists, we are losing people who have an interest in the natural world, and it is critical that we start thinking about new ways of connecting our young people with the natural world. By the way, just for those of you, any of you been in the vault? This is the vault, as it's known. This is where we keep Linnaeus' collections. This is one of the most important scientific spaces on the planet. This amazing, wonderful space full of Carl Linnaeus' collections, which this society looks after, underpins so much of what we know about the natural world. The world would be poorer without this collection, and it is a real honour to look after it. So, I like ducks from an early age, but my enthusiasm for plants was triggered probably by a critical event in my life, and that was something that my mother did that was so very terrible, bless her. This is me a couple of years ago outside my childhood home, the bottom end of Warwickshire. And the scene of my mother's crime, if this is going to work, is just about where my elbow is. When I was a child, this was a flower bed full of roses. And one day, I was walking on the path. I must have probably been 3, maybe 4, I don't quite remember. And I found a bulb. I found the bulb of a hyacinth. I didn't know what it was called then. I just found this bulb, and I just knew instinctively what to do with it. Nobody taught me how to garden or anything. And I dug a little shallow depression and put it in the ground, covered the bottom part of it with soil, and quietly nurtured it. And I spent the next few weeks letting it grow, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And just as it was about to burst bud, I went out one morning to look for it, and it was gone. And I went bananas. My mother claims she doesn't remember this fateful event, but I remember storming into the kitchen, floods of tears and outrage, and saying, "What's happened to my plant?" And she was like, "What plant?" She'd had no idea that I'd been doing this, and she'd weeded it up. And in her contrition, she gave me a piece of the garden to garden for myself. So that was how I first took those first steps into the world of botany and natural history. And again, you know, it's a little story about me, but it's such an important story about how we engage young people today. If they don't get physical contact with the natural world, or visual enrichment in the form of this wonderful, wonderful, incredible book by Reverend Keeble Martin, The New Concise Flora, people like myself and other people of my age would have probably never come into the world of botany. This, I think, probably, how many of you find this, and there's quite a few botanists here, who find this influential in your lives? A fair few of us, yes. This book has made botanists of thousands of us, I suspect. And it does pay massive homage, really, to the power of the image as well as the intellect. My intellectual hero in my youth was this Mac. This is a Polish-German man called Edward Adolf Strasburger. And when I was about 9 or 10, I started reading his textbook on botany. I was that strange a child. And I was enthralled by it. And it's quite interesting because actually, 45 years later, whatever it, or 40 odd years later, is actually the bit I was really most interested in was the taxonomy and systematics, the classification, the naming, the describing of organisms and their evolution. Those were the bits that I was enthralled with, despite the fact that I meandered down the path of horticulture for many years. So these, these objects can really influence us as individuals in our relationship with plants. And we need to do everything we can to enable young people to have access to them and also to spaces like this. So, into the realm of forensics itself. Now, I didn't train to be a forensic botanist. I didn't intend to be. It was an accidental event in my life, which I talk about in the book. And essentially, it was a cold call, not from somebody selling insurance, but from somebody asking me whether I could assist with actually understanding what was going on with a dead body that was found in a ditch. And the person was very heavily decayed, very, very strongly smelling. And for those of you who have been in the proximity of a heavily decaying body, you will know that it is an incredibly intense experience. It hits your physiology and your nose and your sensory systems very, very hard indeed. One of the reasons for that is not because it's horrific, it's our evolutionary biology. It's what we are as organisms. We have evolved to avoid hazardous materials. We've avoiding toxic compounds, things that will poison us, things that will make us ill. And one of the ways we're aware of the hazard in materials is through scent. Scent is one of the oldest scents. And there are a suite of compounds that decaying bodies give off. Scatol, putrescine, cadaverine, and other delightfully named compounds that trigger a response in us of aversion to keep away from that danger. And there's even been this lovely experience where somebody had an aquarium full of fish. They're swimming around merrily. If you drop a little drip of, I think, a scatol in or putrescine in at one end of the aquarium, the fish will all swim to the other end. So our response to these compounds is very, very profound. And we kind of process it into an emotional environment because it's easier for us to think and work in that way because we're emotional beings. Why do I have this strange image of a flower up? Is because putrescine, cadaverine, and scatol, but scatol in particular, have an interesting side story that's botanical. And the evolution of flowering plants is fascinating. This is a magnolia, one of the earliest evolving lineages of flowering plants that remains with us on the planet. Back in the day when flowering plants first came onto the planet, there were no butterflies, there were no bees. There were, however, flies and beetles. So as much as we get our knickers in a twist, and quite rightly so, about butterflies and bees, other insects are immensely important pollinators, such as flies and beetles. And many of these early evolving plants evolved a chemistry that attracted these flies and beetles because they'd already got an enthusiasm, shall we say, for compounds such as scatol, because some of them had evolved to feed off dead and decaying organisms. So the plants co-opted the insects into their biology and what they needed to do. But there's a strange thing about this as well, because many of the plants we have on the planet, particularly night flowering and white flower plants, have got these rich, beautiful flowers, things like jasmine and gardenia. And actually, many of those things you find delightful are producing skatole, amongst other things, to attract us. And this is one of the weird things about this compound. At very low levels in flowers, we find it appealing. But at high levels, we find it repellent. So there's this kind of strange continuum of relationships emotionally to these compounds. And that's really what I was having to deal with on my very first experience of working with a dead person, was this complex physiology telling me to be sick, to run, to get away, and thinking it through intellectually as a botanist. So plants can sort of tell us a little story about them. Also, a strange aside, any fond of vanilla ice cream? Some ice cream lovers? Some brands of ice cream are flavoured with skatole. You'll be pleased to know that it's not derived from synthesizing skatole from corpses or other horrible things like that. It's a relatively easy chemical compound to make, and it's made artificially. But you are imbibing a little bit of death when you have your ice cream. So, one of the things that happens to me as a botanist on a crime scene, and it happens to all botanists around the world over and over again when we're communicating with non-botanists, is this issue of plant blindness. As human beings are terrible at visually recording green things as being entities in their own right. They're just blobs to us in many ways. And I'm sure either intentionally or unintentionally, all you people gravitated towards that terribly boring thing with legs and wings there, when actually the fun and the interest is in the jolly purple thing behind. It's just the way we are. But this actually has massive consequences for somebody like a forensic botanist or somebody interested in environmental forensics working with the police, because they will often be incredibly experienced at a crime in the built environment. So if Edward, my partner over there, got sick to death of me now and bashed me on the head at this moment, the crime would occur in the building, in this space, and we would get on top of it quickly. So most crimes happen in the built environment. Crimes that involve botany and the landscape, trees, forests, fields, woods, lakes, are relatively rare. They do also happen to be, generally speaking, the most awful crimes that we consider terrible. Clearly every murder is terrible, but they are the ones that are often associated with particularly vicious gangland killings or violent crime towards women and children in particular, and nasty crimes of a sexual nature. The inability to really visually record and comprehend plants in these kind of unusual forensic environments really hobbles a lot of police and crime scene managers and detectives, not because they're bad or incompetent, they're just not used to doing with this weird green stuff that somebody like I can come along and help unpick the layers of what's happening. So botany has some real challenges, or botanists rather have real challenges in explaining to the police what can be done in a crime scene. And it's fair to say that if the police are aware of forensic botany on any level, it will be around pollen. Pollen is usually a thing that you hear about in a crime scene drama. It works very well on television because you can have a microscope, you can have a person in a lab coat. They'll probably be doing a bit of DNA work and a bit of human psychology and fingerprinting and gunshot residue and a few other things at the same time. And then there'll be a brilliant botanist as well. All of which is deeply unrealistic, but the pollen grains make pretty pictures on television screens. So they are often as not the thing that we use in crime scene dramas from the botany front. I've been a bit mean about pollen because it is very valuable and very useful, and I will come back to that. But that is essentially the limit of public perception of forensics and botany and crime scene work, and in many cases, many of our police. Now, another thing that we have in botany is a belief, often as not, that botany, forensic botany, is a new discipline. We're a bit nouveau, we're the new kids on the scenario. In fact, forensic botany has been around for quite some time. Botany itself is arguably the oldest science. We've been doing it for thousands of years. But forensic botany certainly goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. This is one of the most famous early botanical cases. It's often called the first case, although it was not the earliest. And I suspect many of you are familiar with the outline of this case. This is the murder of Charles Lindbergh's child, Charles Lindbergh Jr. Charles Lindbergh himself, world-famous aviator, Spirit of Louis, St. Louis, of somewhat dubious political affiliations. Excuse me, I keep tripping over this wire, apologies. That's better. Had a young family. You know, essentially he was one of the kind of sort of superstars of the early 20th century. His family and his young son, Lindbergh Jr., were having a weekend away in a country retreat. The boy was put to bed in the morning. They woke up to find the child gone. So almost immediately, a kidnap search was sent out, and shortly afterwards, this ransom note was discovered. And the police came, and what they found on the grounds, not actually in this position, was this homemade ladder. And I hope you can all see that it is quite rickety, isn't it? It's not B&Q's finest. It's a bit of a mess as the ladders go. And this was one of the pieces of key evidence that the police wanted to explore. Now, this case is really, really famous because it's got lots of conspiracy theories around it about whether the man who was ultimately executed, this man Bruno Hauptmann, whether he was framed. There's a lot of questions around things like the handwriting and the participation of various people. One element of the case which really does stand the test of time is the forensic botany. And a wood anatomist and forest researcher from Wisconsin called Curler was brought in to examine this ladder. Now, the ladder was actually made up of two sets of material. The uprights are essentially recently purchased milled wood from a woodyard, and the treads are recycled bits of wood from another location. Curler did some incredible work by actually taking samples of the uprights and looking at the blade cuts and the patterning of the cut, and he was able to identify what type of blade had cut the wood and the speed at which the blade had rotated, amongst other clever things. And from that information, he was able, having surveyed about 1,000 wood mills in the east of the United States, to get it down to about 5 or 6 wood mills that had this patterning of cut. He then sent them samples of clean wood for them to cut, and from that, he was able to actually localize it to one mill. Incredible piece of work on its own. And it was actually some later, when Hauptmann was arrested, they actually found that Hauptmann had visited this wood mill and had purchased wood. So the botany was quite clear in this area. The real critical blow in terms of Hauptmann's defense from the botany perspective, however, were the treads. So in the earlier stages of the investigation, it was still a kidnapping. The ransom was then paid, and then tragically, a few weeks later, the boy's body was found in a woodland nearby, and clearly turned into a murder inquiry. A few months after that, Hauptmann was arrested with some of the money in his possession, and his home was searched, and Köhler was basically able to examine the wood from the ladder and compare it with spaces and voids in the roof space where they'd been cut out and put together. Essentially, he put the jigsaw back together to show where these elements came from. So on the basis of this work, Hauptmann and other pieces of evidence, Hauptmann was found guilty and subsequently executed. So forensic botany has been around for quite some time. It's also fair to say that actually this case is really important for us because the defense tried, and this is so typical as botanists here, this so often, to trivialize the science that Köhler had done as mere flower dalliancing. You know, it wasn't real grown-up science. It didn't involve, you know, maybe a test tube or something like that and some chemicals. It was rubbish science. Thankfully, the judge did not accept this and rebutted this and said, no, this man is an expert witness. So it is a clear sort of pivotal moment for us in our discipline about how forensic botany came to be seen. Now, having said that, forensic botany is also at times is a bit like being a forest tracker. Because as I say, often as not, crime scene managers and detectives and the police are not used to seeing the landscape in the way a botanist does. I can look at two bushes that are roughly the same height and shape, and I'll know, because I've been looking at plants for many years, and many of my botanical colleagues also, will be saying, well, you know, that bush is 6 months old, that one's 50 years old. And I literally have been in an experience where a police officer has looked at two bushes, and because they're the same size, they've assumed they're the same age. And age of vegetation can be really important if you're doing things like looking for a missing person or a missing body. But a lot of what we do is essentially environmental tracking, forest savvy, landscape savviness. This is actually an example from a case I worked on about 8 years ago of a person who'd been believed to have been murdered by their pimp. And the police this was part of a much larger bundle of dead wood. It was about 10 foot high, about 15 foot across. And murder suspects are very keen on using things like brush or bits of metal sheeting or something like that to cover up shallow graves because they think people like me won't notice. The police were about to examine this location and remove everything, which would have cost a fortune in terms of the manpower of multiple officers and team members working on it, and ultimately would have been pointless because it's a bit like playing that game Kaplunk. You know, when a child and you pull out the straws or something without trying to disturb everything or those twigs again. It's a bit like this. You'll see that in amongst, oops, naughty me, try that again. Oh, I'm going the wrong way, let's try that again. Apologies. You can see this pile of dead wood. This is one of many young saplings growing through the dead wood. This sapling, and the murder was believed to have happened about 6 months earlier. This sapling, that's about 6 months growth. It's the spring and there's the previous year. It would be impossible. You imagine, you're a murderer, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, you're panic-stricken, you're digging a shallow grave to get rid of your victim, you've put them in, you cover the ground up, you put vegetation back over to hide your tracks. It would be virtually impossible not to squish that little delicate seedling. So these kind of tells help somebody like me understand what's happening in the landscape. Similarly, things like lichen and mosses, which like sunlight, they like to grow on the tops of branches if they've been rotated out of position by disturbance. All of these things build up to an understanding of what might have happened in the landscape. I mean, it's only a relatively small example, but you get the picture. Now, stinging nettles. I've got the stinging nettles up because stinging nettles are probably my second most popular botanical colleague in crime scene work. And one of the reasons for this is, like another plant I'll be talking about in a moment, they tend to grow in places where crimes have occurred. They're widespread, abundant, and they tend to grow in places near habitation with people. Another thing about stinging nettles is they're what we call nitrophiles. They like a bit of tasty food. They like nitrogen and nutrients and will grow like the clappers. And they're often kind of referred to as being somewhat emblematic of an idea that many people in forensics and crime scene management have, is that you can spot a dead body in a shallow grave if you're looking for a murder victim by an unusual profusion of growth caused by all these nutrients from beneath. That is basically incorrect. Now that's based ultimately, when you think it through, on some sound botany that I'll come to, but it's also based on actually people doing some clear and simple studies. Some researchers from Italy, I think, about 10 years ago, dug a series of shallow graves. Into some of them, they put pig carcasses, because pigs are incredibly handy to use for forensic studies because they are a similar weight and body mass, fat mass, etc. to us. So they're quite handy to use for this kind of research. They put pigs into some of the shallow graves, and the other shallow graves, they simply put the soil back in. When they looked at the plant regrowth on the two areas, ultimately what they saw was no significant difference between the two. The pigs were not enriching the soil and making the plants grow like the clappers. It's the mere act of digging, possibly in part. However, the story is probably much, much more complicated than even that, because a little bit of understanding of the food requirements and the physiology of plants would tell you that plants feed off simple inorganic compounds with a bit of sunlight, energy, water, carbon dioxide, etc. We, as we are breaking down in those early stages, we are complex organic compounds. We are basically toxic to plants. We're not tasty. It's going to take months, if not years, for us to be broken down by things like bacteria and fungi to get to a point where plants are really going to be able to utilize us. So I'm actually hoping to start doing some research with a group of researchers on understanding how a clandestine burial affects vegetation. It will be interesting scientifically, but also hopefully it may lead to us being able to develop tools to remotely search for murder victims in landscape. Because, believe you me, it is really, really difficult. Now, here's my hero. And also, I'm just going to say very quickly, thank you so much to Serious Child and the wonderful song you've written based upon my jabberings, the joy of botany, and the wonderfulness that is the bramble plant. And we'll put it back on in a moment if those of you didn't hear it. It's a beautiful, beautiful song which talks about the science and the botany of examining a crime scene, but also kind of the emotional dynamic of it. It's a very challenging experience and very interesting. So this is probably my most important botanical partner in crime scene work and forensics. The bramble is a diverse and complex group of plants, which I won't go into in detail now because I'm probably being too slow, aren't I? What's the time? I haven't got a watch. 6:30. Thank you. Now, brambles have a tendency, as I say, to grow in places where dead bodies are often found either on the ground or sometimes with a shallow grave. Now, the good thing about brambles is that they're common, they're abundant, but they're also very, very tidy, organized plants. You don't think of it like that because you think of brambles catching your ankles and tripping you out when you're dog walking and things like that. But brambles are very organized critters. And one of the other wonderful things about them is as they grow, they tend to encapsulate human remains. They lock that person into the landscape. They become part of the environment. And with a little bit of experience and understanding, you can look at the stems of brambles, which broadly speaking do this. Each bramble rootstock, or each individual plant, will have 5, 10 stems on it, depending on the type of plant. Each year it will produce 1 or 2 long whippy growths, and the job of that is to produce energy, sunlight, space, gain territory and control from the other vegetation. Goes through the winter, sleeps a bit, and in the following spring it produces side branches which flower and fruit, and then we like it and it becomes a blackberry. As that second generation stem is coming up, a new one is coming up from underneath. So you get a sort of biennial rhythmic growth pattern, which, with a little bit of practice and careful observation, you can look at the degradation of the stems, because after the second year, in most bramble species, they slide into abeyance and become weaker and weaker and weaker as the other plants outcompete them. So with a little bit of experience, you can look at the number of stems, how they're degrading, to form an assessment of how long this person has been encapsulated by the stems of a bramble plant. Now that can be really, really important, and this is actually from a really important case I worked on about a decade ago. And for the police force in question, they found out, they knew who the person was, they'd been missing for about 10 years, and it was critical for them that they wanted to find out whether this person had been there for 10 years or whether less. Looking at the brambles, another piece of vegetation, we were able to confirm that the person had been there for certainly at least 9 years, probably as long as 10. So brambles can be really helpful providing time frames and also for helping police focus on searches, because quite often bodies are found in woodlands or roadsides or wherever, and if there are no identification things like a credit card or whatever, the police may not have, obviously, fingerprint material, things like that, or dental records. Getting an understanding of they need to look in the missing person records for, say, 2012 can be really useful in speeding up the investigation. So the plants can really help move an investigation along. Now, I'm going to sort of change tempo slightly from the sort of macro environment, so to speak, to more the kind of more detailed laboratory, fragmentary elements of crime scene work. And what I have here as a delightful plant, a relative of the yam, this is black bryony. Now, one of the things for us botanists, and as my colleagues at the Natural History Museum will all tell you, we love to identify plants from nice, healthy specimens, either in the flesh or a very well-presented herbarium specimen that's nice and intact with all the relevant parts to help us identify things. Unfortunately, forensic botany is not like that. I often need to identify fragments of plants which may be, 2 millimeters across. Often they've been exposed to bodily fluids or under a car wheel arch or embedded in mud in somebody's footwear or something like that. But these fragments can be immensely powerful tools in understanding where a suspect or a victim has been, because if you can identify the vegetation, you can then ultimately say, well, yes, it was this woodland or that type of grassland that the person was in. So fragments of vegetation are really, really powerful tools for understanding where somebody may have been, along with other things such as soil science or entomology for that matter. But on top of that, one of the things I'm increasingly keep reminding everybody is the value and wonder of natural history collections. My marvellous former employers at the Natural History Museum, amazing place that it is. We have in the Botany department, what's the latest figure, Mark? About 4.5 million? 5.25 plant specimens collected all over the world over the last 450 years or so. This library of squash-dried plants is a marvellous resource for understanding diversity, climate change, evolution, but it's also for a smarty pants like me in terms of when I walk into court. Because if I tell a judge and a jury and a barrister that I've identified a plant on a leaf fragment from, say, a tiny tip, and I've said, oh, yes, it's this plant, that exposes me to great risk if you've got a particularly fierce barrister. Having the ability to say, and I checked my observations against a natural history collection, is an invaluable way of buffering myself and also, frankly, from validating things and making sure I've got the right answer from how things happen in court. So natural history collections are wondrous in many, many ways. Now, Christmas dinner, as we head towards that season. This is my Christmas dinner from a few years ago. And one of the things I've got this up for is because it takes us in a particularly gruesome direction, I'm afraid. Sorry, folks. So Christmas dinner and gruesomeness. Now, I've done a little bit of this kind of work, and the work I'm alluding to are stomach contents. Because sometimes I will be sent stomach contents from people who are believed to have committed suicide, or they're not quite sure, and they'll want me to identify the vegetation fragments that are within there. Again, natural history collections are brilliant for this kind of validation and comparison. On top of which, these things like onions, Brussels sprouts, carrots, potatoes, the skins, the cell surfaces and everything, even after cooking and a bit of time down here, a lot of the anatomy and the structure of the cells remains, and you can identify the person's last meal. Now, there's a couple of researchers in America called the Box, who are essentially experts in not only identifying these tiny fragments, but also working with medical professionals to actually create a chronology for how long they've actually been in the digestive tract. So forensic botany can help us understand some pretty ghastly things. This is probably the most ghastly of all recent cases in Britain. These two attractive images relate to the awful murder of a young boy who was given the name Adam. And Adam, as I heard several times, yes, yeah. Adam was a young boy of West African origin. He was ultimately identified through genetics as being probably from around Benin City in Nigeria. Unfortunately, neither his relatives nor the perpetrators of his murder were found. Adam's dismembered torso was found in the River Thames. I suspect quite a few now, but yes, remember this case, what, 15, 20 years ago probably now, quite a while back. One of the dreadful things that they came to learn about what had happened to Adam was based upon his stomach contents, because the stomach contents had pieces of skin of bean and seed and fruit and other bits of foliage in them that were sent to a botanist at Kew Gardens. This was before I became involved in forensics. And they were able to identify that Adam had consumed, probably forcibly, a meal containing Physostigma venenosum, this highly toxic plant, which is associated with various traditional religious activities and poisoning and such like in West Africa, highly toxic, and the more famously poisonous and widespread datura. So Adam was given a lethal toxic cocktail to kill him, or possibly just to make him unconscious before he was murdered. So I told you it wasn't all going to be pleasant. So that case tragically remains unsolved. I think if it were to come into play now, we would have more tools to our disposal. One of the evolving scientific disciplines that I have great faith in for the future is the area of environmental DNA. Using DNA to characterize what's on somebody's footwear, on their clothes, and link that to a piece of landscape or environment is an immensely powerful tool. eDNA basically means you're grabbing all of the environmental data from a particular landscape or pond or wherever as a means of building up almost like a fingerprint, a profile of that place. Now, eDNA actually originated largely in the field of non-native species control. And rather charmingly, it's associated with the control of sea lamprey in North America. Now, sea lamprey are an introduced species into the Great Lakes of North America, where they are having major impacts on native species there. And eDNA has been used because sea lamprey betray their presence every time they wee. Because when you wee, you slough off skin cells from inside your urinary tract. Those cells obviously have DNA in them, and you can detect sea lamprey DNA and wee just from water samples. You can then use that to identify focal points of populations of sea lamprey in Great Lakes systems to challenge and to control them. So environmental DNA has got a huge amount to offer in the future. One of the problems is forensically is that at the moment it is still rather expensive. Even though DNA work has overall become much, much cheaper, it is still challenging in terms, particularly in these financially challenged times, to pay for it. The other thing is that the data we get from eDNA work is vast. It's almost brain melting. So for some samples I worked on before I left the museum, we were getting about 1,500 types of bacteria and microbe just from one tiny soil sample. So the quantity of data you get is enormous. Finding a way of processing that and presenting that in a way that doesn't make the jury's brain collapse is really, really important. One of the things I've noticed is actually how challenging some scientific information for juries are. We expect a lot of them these days with some of the scientific evidence that's put in front of them. I've done a little bit of work on diatoms, but mainly through my colleague. Now, diatoms are fascinating because their cells have these outer cases which are rock hard. They're made of silica. They can withstand burning. And one of the awful things about drowning is that in one type of drowning called wet drowning, as we breathe in intensely in those last moments, diatom cells get pushed through the membranes of our lungs into our blood and circulatory system, and when we die, they lodge there. We can extract the diatom cells after death and identify them to confirm potentially the presence or absence of drowning. So they're very, very interesting organisms. They're also exceptionally diverse and very beautiful. I'm going to speed up a bit because I'm being really naughty and jabbering too much. Now, I mentioned pollen earlier on and said, I was a bit mean about it, but pollen and other things called pollinomorphs, spores and such like, are really valuable tools. But what we really want from pollen to link it with a suspect and to a crime scene is not widespread abundant pollen types necessarily, such as pine trees, which are dispersed by wind. We want things that are linked to insect or other forms of animal dispersal, because these types of pollen are much less mobile in the environment. They're much less likely to be found many, many miles away from their home. And I've had, I think my favourite case on this was getting incredibly interesting fern spores from a rare fern tree, fern tree. We were able to look at the data from the pollen, this fern in particular, the soil science, which also had lots of hydrocarbons, which indicated an industrial environment with a very unusual industrial process. The original search area we had was 2 counties, and we were able to take that down to literally a few square miles, putting all of these pieces of information together. Now, I suspect many of you have heard of a lady called Patricia Wiltshire. She's been doing crime scene forensics for a lot longer than I have, and she's very famous in the field, and she's also brought out a book very recently, so timing and everything. This represents a very interesting case that her and her husband worked on a few years ago. And this involves the spores of fungi, not this particular one. I've just got it up here because it's a pretty fungus and I like it. And it involves a case of a young woman and a man who'd had a sexual relationship with each other. They'd had sex together consensually in the morning. She then accused him of raping her in the afternoon. He denied it and said, no, I did not. And it was consensual. Obviously now, because they'd had contact with each other, you couldn't use DNA because they'd both confirmed that they'd done this. What Patricia and her husband did was take soil samples from his footwear, from the woodlands that he said he'd been in, and the grassland that she said they'd been in, and Patricia and her husband were able to confirm that actually he was lying, because the spores on his footwear matched the grassland. When presented with that information, he actually confessed straight away, and the young woman was saved the experience of an adversarial court experience. So botany in forensics can be very powerful means of securing a conviction as well. And I'm going to end just on this last thing, which is, it's fair to say a lot of you who know me know that I'm a often rather jokey person, but, forensics and crime scene is serious. And working with the dead is an incredible experience. It's a real honour, and there is nothing like holding somebody's skull in a woodland and trying to work out what's happened to them. And the other last thing is just to say is how plants themselves connect us with our emotional relationship towards death. Because this is the cemetery iris, which we saw down in the Alpujarras. Do you remember seeing this? Down in southern Spain. And this plant is associated in Islamic culture with funerary traditions, graveyards, etc., and is planted in cemeteries. And when I was in the Alpujarras in southern Spain, this plant still grows in the cemeteries and the village edges of what were Muslim culture towns and cities of southern Spain. So the plants have this little sort of ghost themselves of our emotional relationship with death. Thank you.